Chapter 9 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Defender of Humanity. At the instant that Charles Sumner entered that iron and marble body, as his friend Charles Francis Adams very fitly characterized the Senate of the United States of those days, the last of its early giants was leaving it forever. Calhoun had already passed away, Webster was in Millard Fillmore's cabinet, and Clay was escaping, in his own picturesque and pathetic phrase, scarred by spears and worried by wounds, to drag his mutilated body to his lair and lie down and die. The representative of compromise was making his exit from one door of the stage, the representative of conscience his entrance through another. Was it accident or prophecy? Were the bells of destiny ringing in the valiant man and free, the larger heart, the kindlier hand, and ringing out the darkness of the land? But whether accident or prophecy, Sumner had advanced into the midst of a hostile camp. On either side enemies surrounded him. Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats hated him. Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats likewise hated him. He was wholly without party affiliations, well nigh friendless. But thanks to the revolution which was working in the free states, he was not absolutely so, for William H. Seward was already there, and Salmon P. Chase and John P. Hale and Hannibal Hamlin. Under these circumstances it behooved him to take no precipitate step. A smaller man, a leader less fearless and wise, might have blundered just here by leaping too hastily with his cause into the arena of debate. Sumner did nothing of the kind. His self-poise and control for 9 months were simply admirable. Endurance, says Lowell, is the crowning quality, and patience all the passion of great hearts. Certainly during those trying months they were Sumner's, the crowning quality and the passion. First the blade, he had to acquaint himself with the routine and business of legislation. Then the ear, had to study the personnel of the Senate, become master of the situation. 4 times he essayed his strength on subjects of inferior interest to the one which he was carrying in his heart, as mothers carry their unborn babes. Each trial of his parliamentary wings raised him in the estimation of friends and foes. His welcome to Kossuth and his tribute to Robert Rantoul, Jr., proved him to be an accomplished orator. His speech on the public land question evinced him, besides, strong in history, argument, and law. No vehemence of anti-slavery pressure, no shock of angry criticism coming from home, was able to jostle him out of his fixed determination to speak only when he was ready, upon the paramount subject of his own and the nation's thoughts. Winter went and spring appeared, and yet his silence remained. Summer, too, was waning before he was really prepared to begin. Then, like an August storm, he burst on the Senate and the country in that powerful performance, Freedom, National, Slavery, Sectional. Like all of Mr. Sumner's efforts, whether popular, parliamentary, or academic, this one was carefully written out and memorized. He was not absolutely incapable of speaking without this sort of preparation, though what he said then was apt to lack spontaneity and the moral fervor which distinguished his written words. When speaking without the aid of manuscript preparation, his utterance acquired an air of what may be termed literary dictation, wanted the true requisite for the forcible declamation of an orator. He was deficient in the qualities of the great debater, as the reader has probably surmised, was not able to think effectively on his feet, to give and take hard hits within the short range of extemporaneous and hand-to-hand encounters. Clay and John Quincy Adams were preeminent in this species of intellectual warfare. Webster and Calhoun were formidable. Sumner doubtless never experienced that quick sympathy and marvelous interplay of emotion and intelligence between himself and an audience, which made Wendell Phillips the unrivaled monarch of the anti-slavery platform. Sumner's was the eloquence of elaboration rather than the eloquence of inspiration. What he did gave the impression of size, of length, breadth and thoroughness. He needed space and he needed time. These granted, he could indeed be tremendous. He was tremendous on this occasion before the Senate. His theme furnishes the keynote and the keystone of his opposition to slavery. Garrison, Phillips, and Theodore D. Weld appealed against the evil to a common humanity, to the primary moral instincts of mankind, in condemnation of its villainies and oppressions. The appeal carried them beyond and above constitutions and codes to the unwritten and eternal right. Sumner appealed against the institution, to the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, to the spirit and letter of the Constitution, to the sentiments and hopes of the fathers, and to the early history and policy of the country which they had founded. All these were for freedom and against slavery. Their reverse was error. Public opinion was error-bound. The North was error-bound, and so was the South. Parties and politicians were error-bound. Freedom was the heritage of the nation. Slavery had robbed it of its birthright. Slavery must be dispossessed. Carthago est delenda. As it was in the beginning, so it hath ever been. The world needs light. The great want of his country on the subject of slavery Sumner believed to be light. This speech of his was but a repetition in a world of wrong of the divine fiat, let there be light. Light burst from it upon the national darkness, such light as a thunderbolt scatters, shriveling and shivering the deep-rooted lie and sin of the land. A new hour that speech struck for America. Not before in the government had freedom touched so high a mark. Heretofore the slave power had been arrogant and exacting. A keen observer might then have foreseen that freedom also would some day become exacting and aggressive. For its advancing billows had broken in the resounding periods and passions of its eloquent champion. The manner of the orator which marked all his public deliverances was that of a man speaking with authority, of a man who defers to no one, prefers no one to himself. It was, in fine, the imperious manner of an orator conscious of the possessions of great powers and of ability to use them. Such a champion of freedom as was Sumner, the crisis required. God made one American statesman without moral joints when he made Charles Sumner. He could not bend the supple hinges of the knee to the South, for he had none to bend. He must needs stand erect, inflexible, uncompromising, an image of Puritan harshness and Puritan grandeur. Against his granite-like character and convictions, the haughty will of the South was to hurl itself in vain. Orator and oration revealed to the slave power, as in a magic mirror, some things which before had seemed indistinct and elusive, like Birnam wood moving toward high Dunsinane. But the miracle was now performed. The impossible had happened. The insurgent moral sense of a mud-sill and shopkeeping North has at last found in the government voice and vent. With what rising apprehensions must the South have listened to these bold and prophetic words! The movement against slavery is from the everlasting arm. Even now it is gathering its forces, soon to be confessed everywhere. It may not yet be felt in the places of office and power, but all who can put their ears humbly to the ground will hear and comprehend its incessant and advancing tread. Before the delivery of this speech, Sumner had obtained a taste of the intolerance and tyranny of the iron and marble body in the interest of slavery. As early as July, he had endeavored to get the floor for remarks on the fugitive slave law, and was thwarted by the vigilant hostility of the masters of the Senate. He did, however, hold the ear of that body long enough in July to notify it of his intention to move at an early day the repeal of the obnoxious law, and to explain why he had not attempted to address the members on the subject before. After this, it was openly asserted that he should not be allowed to carry out his intention during the session then pending, but the slave power knew not the man whom it had determined to silence. Vigilantly watched as he was by his foes, he was no less vigilant in watching for a parliamentary opening for himself and his cause in the citadel of slavery. On August 26, 1852, the opening came, and quickly Sumner perceived it, and in a flash was through it and upon the floor of the chamber. On that day, the civil and diplomatic bill being under consideration by the Senate, Mr. Hunter of Virginia moved an amendment to the same to provide for the payment of sundry officers of the government in the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. Mr. Hunter was so intent upon safeguarding Southern property that, for the nonce, he quite forgot that he and his colleagues were trying to silence an alert and determined adversary. No sooner had he thus exposed his flanks than Sumner dashed promptly in with an amendment to the amendment, to wit, that no such allowance be authorized for any expenses incurred in executing the Fugitive Slave Bill, and that the same be repealed. It was in support of this amendment, and by this stratagem, that he finally obtained the floor and made his first great speech against slavery in the Senate. Sumner did not limit his opposition to the giant wrong of the land to any particular place or occasion or mode of attack. He struck it whenever, wherever, and with whatsoever he got a chance. He made use, in the noblest sense, of all the means which God and nature put within his reach to weaken and destroy the slave power in the government, and the cruel proscriptive spirit which it generated toward the colored race in the free states. His argument in favor of equality before the law in Massachusetts and against the constitutionality of separate colored schools in Boston before the Supreme Court of that state, December 4, 1849, was action against the national iniquity along this line. He made for the time being the Supreme Court an anti-slavery meeting house, and its bar an anti-slavery platform, and a very effective anti-slavery agent he proved. All the more so because of the presence of Robert Morris, a black lawyer whom he had associated with himself as counsel in the case. So also should be classed his speech entitled "The Party of Freedom, Its Necessity and Practicability," delivered before the Free Soil State Convention of Massachusetts, held at Lowell, September 15, 1852. Sumner's purpose in it was to create a freedom power in the North to meet and master the slave power of the South. He was a member of the convention to revise and amend the Constitution of Massachusetts in 1853, and here again 2 of the 4 speeches made by him during the sessions of that body must be viewed as indirect attacks upon slavery and its progeny, caste prejudice. One of these speeches was on the power of the state over the militia, in which he argues that in the organization of the volunteer military companies of the Commonwealth there shall be no distinction of color or race. The other address was on Bill of Rights, their history and policy, which furnished a capital text for an anti-slavery sermon from the great lay preacher of the gospel of national righteousness. With these sturdy blows upon the many-headed wrong with which he was battling must be classed his address entitled "Finger Point from Plymouth Rock," given by him on the occasion of the festival held August 1, 1853, in commemoration of the embarkation of the Pilgrims. Although called up to speak to the toast, "The Senate of the United States, the concentrated light of the stars of the Union," he nevertheless chose his own text, which was more in consonance with the thought which had then possession of his heart and mind. While he made no overt allusion to the irrepressible conflict then raging between freedom and slavery in the Republic, yet it was palpable to all that behind the struggles of the persecuted Puritans for religious liberty, he was exalting the struggles of the friends of freedom of his own day, and of the country founded by the devotion to duty and the courage and constancy of those 17th-century reformers and foes of oppression. But while he thus utilized all the ways and means which his increasing influence and opportunities were bringing to him in well-delivered blows upon the head of the great iniquity, his seat in the Senate furnished him now his chief coign of vantage in the war. From this commanding position he trained his heaviest guns, poured his most destructive fire upon the strongholds of the slave power. After the long silence of those early months was broken by the broadside of his first great speech against the slave despotism, the deep thunder of his artillery was heard oftener speaking from those heights. Meanwhile, the temper of the South was growing more unreasonable, violent, and arrogant. Worsted as she clearly was in the contest for political supremacy since the admission of California as a free state into the Union, she nevertheless clung passionately to her pretensions to sectional leadership and control. As she had no longer anything to lose and much to recover, her action acquired a certain defiant and reckless tone. If finally defeated in her purpose, there were in the background secession and a Southern Confederacy to retreat upon. On the other hand, the North was the theater where was enacting a kind of double drama. There was, in the first place, the capital issue between it and its Southern rival, the struggle for political supremacy in the Union. There was, besides, the conflict between its aspirations for sectional ascendancy and its anxiety for the preservation of the Union. This byplay of its aspirations and its apprehensions rose at times to the gravity of the main action. It was this double movement of the passions which destroyed Northern unity of purpose in the presence of danger and of its Southern antagonists, gave to its leaders a timid, halting, irresolute disposition, pulled them back from any decisive step the moment they had espied the shadow of a crisis above the national horizon. While the slave power gained constantly in singleness and energy of aim, the freedom power, because of this duality of purpose, was subjected to ever recurrent irregularities and perturbations of conduct. The situation at the North was still further complicated by the disintegration and chaos into which the two old parties were tumbling there, and by the fierce jealousies and rivalries of party leaders within them. The conditions in 1854 were all propitious to Southern aggression, favorable for the commission of some bold, unprecedented crime against liberty. Clay did not live to see the black spirits and white, red spirits and gray, which issued from the cauldron of 1850, about which he sang his sad swan song. Calhoun had preceded him to the everlasting quiet of the grave. Webster, broken-hearted and dishonored, yet grand still in his ruin, followed their wearied way to the tomb. At last the three master lights to which all men had looked in trial hours were quenched in their lofty towers. The sea had risen, and the wind, and the witching voices of storm and night. They were abroad and mingling, those black spirits and white, which the music of their triune and triumphant eloquence had so often enraptured back to hell. As these imposing luminaries sank one after another into the void, darkness and tumult advanced apace through the land. It was at this juncture that the most striking and perhaps sinister figure in American party history loomed into greatness. Stephen A. Douglas was a curious and grim example of the survival of Viking instincts in the modern office-seeker. On the sea of politics he was a veritable water-dog, daring, unscrupulous, lawless, transcendently able, and transcendently heartless. The sight of the presidency affected him in much the same manner as did the effete and rich civilizations and countries of Latin Europe affect his roving robber prototypes 1,200 years before. It stirred every drop of his sea-wolf's blood to get possession of it. His squatter sovereignty device was indeed the pirate ship that carried consternation to many an anxious community in the free states. In these circumstances, and with such a Northern ally, the South undertook the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, the introduction of a measure by Mr. Dodge of Iowa on December 14, 1853, in the Senate for the organization of the upper division of the Louisiana Purchase into the territory of Nebraska was made the occasion for achieving this result. All that country, the reader doubtless knows, the slave line of 1820 had consecrated forever to freedom. Calhoun, bold as he was in action, had not ventured to counsel the abrogation of that memorable covenant between the sections, because the agitation growing out of such a proposition would disturb the peace and harmony of the Union, as he put it. The South had got the worst of the bargain, he reasoned, was overreached, but a bargain was a bargain, and therefore the slave states should stand by their plighted faith unless released by the free. But what the great nullifier would not counsel, his disciples and successors dared to do. The execution of the scheme was adroitly committed to the leadership of Douglas. Thus the movement seemed to come from the North, and thus did the South hope to conceal the sectionalism and rapacity of its design. Clearly did her leaders foresee that what they would do for slavery ought to be done deftly and quickly before the full tide and rush of public sentiment at the North should overtake and overwhelm all such mischievous attempts. Texas, upon which Calhoun had built strong hopes of prolonged Southern ascendancy in the Union, had disappointed Southern expectations in that regard. Far easier it was found to annex an empire than to people it. The emergency states provided for by the bill admitting Texas to statehood were not forthcoming to meet the exigencies of the slave power. On the political chessboard there was but a single move left for it to make, and that was the prevention of any further relative increase in the number of free states. This final checkmate that power designed to accomplish by throwing down the wall of partition between freedom and slavery erected by the Missouri Compromise. Here indeed were spaces larger than the 13 original states to be occupied, to figure sooner or later with decisive weight and effect in the struggle for political supremacy between the two halves of the republic. The exclusive right of freedom to the occupancy of this immense region was to be set aside, and to slavery was to be granted an equality of interest and ownership in the same. Hence the powerful practical utility of the squatter sovereignty scheme of Douglas as an instrument of demolition. Then, to the North might recall, so possibly the South reasoned, that plausible and pernicious notion of Webster of the futility of reaffirming an ordinance of nature, of re-enacting the will of God, and cooperate in the work of destruction. But the free states did not take at all to the monstrous proposition. It threw them, on the contrary, into a fever of alarm and activity in view of the disastrous consequences which impended from the measure to their interests and institutions. The self-love and sectionalism of the North took fire. Everywhere through the free states there spread and blazed Northern protestation and opposition to the consummation of the dark conspiracy. The repeal fought its way through Congress during 4 stormy months. Blows fell upon it and its authors, thick and furious, from Seward, Chase, Wade, Fessenden, Giddings, and Jarrett Smith. But Sumner was the colossus of the hour, the heart of flame of his section. It was he, more than any other, who swung the ponderous Northern hammer and smote plot and plotters with the stern strength of the Northern giant. Such a speech as was his landmarks of freedom only crises breed. It was a groundswell of the moral throes of the times, a lava tide of argument, appeal, history, and eloquence. The august rights and wrath of the Northern people thundered and lightened along its rolling lines. Accomplish thou thy manhood and thyself is the cry of humanity, ringing ever in the soul of the reformer. He must needs bestir himself in obedience to the high mandate. This labor is the special mission of great men. It was without doubt Sumner's. He stood for the manhood of the North, of the slave of the nation. For this he strenuously toiled. It shines in every sentence of that memorable speech, and of the shorter one in defense of the New England clergy, made at midnight on that black Thursday of May, which closed the bitter struggle and consummated the act of repeal. Here is a passage from the latter of these speeches. From the depths of my soul, as loyal citizen and as senator, I plead, remonstrate, protest against the passage of this bill. I struggle against it as against death, but as in death itself corruption puts on immortality, so from the sting of this hour I find assurance of that triumph by which freedom will be restored to her immortal birthright in the Republic. Sir, the bill you are about to pass is at once the worst and the best on which Congress ever acted. Yes, sir, worst and best at the same time. It is the worst bill inasmuch as it is a present victory of slavery. Among the crimes of history another is soon to be recorded, which no tears can blot out, and which in better days will be read with universal shame. Do not start. The Tea, Tax, and Stamp Act, which aroused the patriot rage of our fathers were virtues by the side of your transgression, nor would it be easy to imagine at this day any measure which more openly defied every sentiment of justice, humanity, and Christianity. Am I not right, then, in calling it the worst bill on which Congress ever acted? There is another side to which I gladly turn, sir. It is the best bill on which Congress ever acted, for it annuls all past compromises with slavery and makes any future compromises impossible. Thus it puts freedom and slavery face to face and bids them grapple. Who can doubt the result? It opens wide the door of the future, when at last there will really be a North, and the slave power will be broken, when this wretched despotism will cease to dominate over our government, no longer impressing itself upon everything at home and abroad, when the national government will be divorced in every way from slavery, and according to the true intention of our fathers, freedom will be established by Congress everywhere, at least beyond the local limits of the States. Slavery will then be driven from usurped foothold here in the District of Columbia, in the national territories, and elsewhere beneath the national flag. The Fugitive Slave Bill, Sumner would never call it law, as vile as it is unconstitutional, will become a dead letter, and the domestic slave trade, so far as it can be reached, but especially on the high seas, will be blasted by congressional prohibition. Everywhere within the sphere of Congress the great northern hammer will descend to smite the wrong, and the irresistible cry will break forth, "No more slave states." Significant enough, had the South ears to interpret it aright, was the prolonged applause in the galleries which greeted a passage from the earlier speech in which the orator likened the power of slavery in loosening and destroying the character of Northern men to the fabled influence of the black magnetic mountain in the Arabian story, whereby the iron bolts which held together the strong timbers of a stately ship floating securely on the distant wave were drawn out till the whole fell apart and became a disjointed wreck. So were the principles of Northern representatives sucked out by the black magnetic mountain of the slave power, and from the miserable loosened fragments is found that human anomaly, a Northern man with Southern principles. "Sir," exclaimed the orator, "no such man can speak for the North," and thereupon the galleries burst into applause. Freedom had grown bolder. It had invaded the Senate chamber. It had invaded also the galleries of that chamber with unwonted sounds and emotions. They were the burning brands borne by the swift rising winds of public opinion at the North, from the fierce fires spreading and blazing from one end of that section to the other against the monumental perfidy and iniquity of the slave power in throwing down the sacred landmark of liberty erected by the Missouri Compromise. The monition of Sumner that the passage of the Act of Repeal would mark the close of an era of compromises was made also by William H. Seward in different words, but with not less certainty of sense. "The shifting sands of compromise," said he to the Senate, "are passing from under my feet, and they are now, without agency of my own, taking hold again on the rock of the Constitution. It shall be no fault of mine if they do not remain firm." This seems to me auspicious of better days and wiser legislation. Through all the darkness and gloom of the present hour, bright stars are breaking that inspire me with hope and excite me to perseverance. The greed of the South had overreached itself, for in attempting to seize fresh advantages in its contest with the North for the political balance of the federal system, it had, by the passionate fears and the deep sense of injury thereby aroused toward it throughout that section, unwittingly put in peril its erstwhile strong, almost impregnable position in the Union. The conduct of the South at this juncture of the irrepressible conflict furnished another illustration of the truth of the saying that whom the gods would destroy they first make mad. Madder and yet more mad from this time grew the slave section. Sumner's bold and uncompromising tone, pending the great debate, mightily incensed the South against him. This feeling of growing hate and hostility toward him on the part of the slave power was fanned almost into an open violence by an incident arising out of the execution of the fugitive slave law in Boston, and which occurred on the evening of May 26th, in the morning of which Sumner concluded his midnight speech on the Kansas-Nebraska bill. This was the attempt to rescue Anthony Burns by a number of citizens who attacked the courthouse where the fugitive slave was confined for safekeeping, and during which one of the slave guard was killed by a pistol shot from the rescuing party. The news of this attempt to defeat the execution of the slave law and of the killing of one of the guard in the melee produced a profound sensation in Washington, aroused the worst passions against Sumner, who was immediately charged with responsibility for the act and denounced by administrative organs as a murderer, notwithstanding the fact that at the hour of the attack upon the courthouse, the speech of the Massachusetts senator to which the South attributed the tragedy had not then reached Boston. It was not until the next day that it arrived by mail in the city, but the South was in no rational mood for the reception of such swift fulfillment of Sumner's prediction that the abrogation of the Compromise of 1820 would scatter dragons' teeth, fructify in civil strife and feud. Even while he was speaking, the dragon's teeth were fructifying in the stony soil of the Bay State. And now a cry was raised against Sumner, a cry of insane hate, of gathering malignity on the part of the slave power. He was ruthlessly assailed by the Union and the star organs of the administration in language plainly intended to make him odious at the Capitol and to provoke against him violence of some sort, open or secret. Boston, in arms against the Constitution, invade the former Journal, and an abolition fanatic, the distant leader, safe from the fire and the faggot, he invokes from his seat in the Senate of the United States, giving the command. Men shot down in the faithful discharge of duty to a law based upon a constitutional guarantee, and the word which encourages the assassin given by a man who has sworn on the holy evangelist and the presence of his Maker to support the Constitution of the country. Let Sumner and his infamous gang feel, raved the latter newspaper, that he cannot outrage the fame of his country, counsel treason to its laws, incite the ignorant to bloodshed and murder, and still receive the support and countenance of the society of this city, which he has done so much to vilify. While the person of a Virginia citizen is only safe from rudeness and outrage behind the serried ranks of armed men, Charles Sumner is permitted to walk among the slave catchers and fire eaters of the South in peace and security. Thus raged the Southern heathen against him. The sinister appeals to the mob spirit by such powerful papers had their effect. In Alexandria, just across the river, the incubation of mischief advanced apace. Violence was beginning to peck through the thin shell of law and order which confined it in that region. The air of the capital was full of ugly rumors of plans and plots to put the abolition fanatic down. Now he was to be seized as hostage for the surrender of Burns, now to receive some personal affront and violence, now to have a ball put through his head, all of which menaces were duly communicated to their object with a view, doubtless, of driving him from his post in Washington. But those who sought to cow him into flight or silence surely knew him not. Unawed and unterrified, he pursued the even tenor of his ways, walking to and from the Senate by Pennsylvania Avenue, the while, as was his wont, unarmed. One day at a restaurant where he dined, he was threatened and insulted by a Southern fire-eater. Like begets like, and this violent temper of the South begot at the North a temper of similar violence, as witness the following, written to Mr. Sumner by gallant Joseph R. Hawley of Connecticut, at present a United States Senator from that state. If you really think there is any danger worth mentioning, I wish you would telegraph me instantly. I will come to Washington by the next train and quietly stand by. I have revolvers and can use them, and while there should not be a word of unnecessary provocation, still if anybody in Alexandria or Washington really means to trouble you, or any other free Democrat there, you know several can play at that game. This brave offer of the future Union general was called forth by the alarming rumors in regard to Mr. Sumner's safety, which were telegraphed May 31st from the seat of the government to New York and other places. As Mr. Hawley was then feeling, so were thousands through the free states. If the blood of the South was fast mounting to the fighting point, so was that of the North. So strong was the fighting feeling grown at the North that the Secretary of the Peace Society, Reverend George C. Beckwith, who saw Anthony Burns return to slavery, could at thought of the deed write in this bellicose vein to Mr. Sumner: "I think I am still true to my peace principles, but my heart is stirred to its lowest depths of indignation, and I say frankly to men who applaud what our forefathers did, that we have now even stronger reasons for resistance to the slave power than they had to the usurpations of England." From this time, Sumner's position at Washington became one of constantly present peril. Hated, insulted, denounced, menaced by mob violence, his life was every day in jeopardy, but he did not flinch or falter. Freedom was his master, humanity his guide. He climbed the hazardous steps that conducted him to duty, heedless of the dangers which arose in his path. His collisions with the slave leaders and their northern allies became thenceforth more frequent and fierce. Everywhere he turned he encountered increasing intolerance and malignity. All the powers of the man became braced, eager, alert. It was many against one, but that one was in himself a host, when roused as he was, not only by the grandeur of his cause, but also by a sense of personal indignity and persecution. Whoever else could, he would not submit to senatorial insult and bondage. His rising temper began to thrust like a rapier. Scorn he matched with scorn, and clashed pride against pride. As a regiment bristles with bayonets, so bristled he with the cold and glittering steel of facts and figures which mortally stabbed with the merciless truth of history the superlative insolence and pretensions of the South. His sarcasm was terrific, possessed the ferocity of a panther. He upon whom it sprang got his quivering flesh torn away. It is not in human nature to suffer such lacerations of the feelings as Sumner now inflicted upon the South, and readily forgive or forget their author. The slave power did not forgive Sumner, nor forget its scars. The rendition of the second fugitive slave from Boston was a bitter dose of humiliation and inhumanity for that city to swallow. With many of the merchant class who had previously supported the infamous law as a part of the compromise measures of 1850, and for the sake of composing the differences between the two halves of the Union, this ocular demonstration of its atrocious wickedness produced a decided feeling of moral revulsion from the act. Such were now ready to ask for its repeal, to wash their hands of all complicity in the crime of returning fellow men to bondage. They joined with the Friends of Freedom in signing a petition to Congress praying for the abrogation of the law. This petition, with the names of 2,900 petitioners appended, was on June 22, 1854, presented to the Senate, and on the 26th debated by that body. Several senators had engaged in the wordy warfare which ensued, among whom was Mr. G. W. Jones of Tennessee, before Mr. Sumner gained the floor. Mr. Jones had given the Senate a taste of the bullying assurance of his section in debate, and had put the question, "Can anyone suppose that if the Fugitive Slave Act be repealed, this Union can exist?" with the air of a champion who flings his gage of battle down, and dares any man to pick it up. Sumner, in beginning his speech, lifted the insolent challenge and threw it full in the face of the doughty Tennessean. Thus: "Mr. President, I begin by answering the interrogatory propounded by the Senator from Tennessee, Mr. Jones. Can any one suppose that if the Fugitive Slave Act be repealed, this Union can exist? To which I reply at once that if the Union be in any way dependent on an act, I cannot call it a law so revolting in every respect as that to which he refers, then it ought not to exist." To much else that has fallen from that senator I do not desire to reply. Matters already handled again and again in the long drawn-out debates of this session he has discussed at length. Like the excited hero of Macedonia, he has renewed his past conflicts, and thrice he routed all his foes, and thrice he slew the slain. With this half playful, half dangerous attention to Mr. Jones, he shoves him into space and attacks the subject of debate, restating his arguments against the constitutionality of the Slave Act, repeating his historical parallel between it and the Stamp Act, reiterating his stern denunciation of it as in violation of the law of God and of the Constitution of the United States, all of which was by no means calculated to soften the feelings of the South toward him, or to turn from him its growing rage. On the contrary, they hardened the hatred of that section toward him, and unloosed upon him a pack of furious Southern representatives, abetted and outdone by a Northern man with Southern principles, John Pettit of Indiana. Half a dozen irate senators, when Mr. Sumner sat down, proceeded to assail him with an acrimony and brutality that went beyond anything of the kind before perpetrated by the Southern side of the Senate in debate. A.P. Butler of South Carolina and James M. Mason of Virginia, author of the Fugitive Slave Bill, were coarsely and savagely insolent and offensive, but for that matter the four other assailants of the Massachusetts senator were coarsely and savagely insolent and offensive to a high degree. These others it is well to remember, and I shall therefore name them. They were C. Clay of Alabama, A. Dixon of Kentucky, Stephen R. Mallory of Florida, afterward Secretary of the Navy in the cabinet of Jefferson Davis, and that human anomaly named above, a Northern man with Southern principles. Those were the slave champions who, one after another, flung themselves upon the thick bosses of Sumner's shield with a violence and virulence of vituperation more beseeming the manners of a slave plantation than the dignity and order of the upper branch of the national legislature. In the midst of his excitement and tirade, Mr. Butler, turning to Mr. Sumner, demanded to know whether he would return a fugitive slave, and got the swift and crushing retort, "Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing?" Whereupon the Carolinian was thrown into a state of mind in which his fury and amazement at such unheard-of audacity on the part of a Northern senator quite got the better of him, and when to his apoplectic interrogatory, "You stand in my presence as a co-equal senator and tell me that it is a dog's office to execute the Constitution of the United States," Sumner quietly remarked, "I recognize no such obligation," meaning, of course, to return fugitive slaves to their masters. The Southerners' mental condition may be better imagined than described. Mr. Mason, who was to add to his evil eminence as the author of the Fugitive Slave Bill a sorry and sensational distinction in connection with the War of the Rebellion, was no whit behind Mr. Butler in insolence and violence of behavior and speech. "Why, sir," he cried, "am I speaking of a fanatic, one whose reason is dethroned? Can such a one expect to make impressions upon the American people from his vapid, vulgar declaration here, accompanied by a declaration that he would violate his oath now recently taken?" Through 2 days the assailants of Mr. Sumner ran the debate, if debate it can be called, in which every note in alternation, and sometimes altogether in the gamut of rage and hate, was sounded and resounded by them. On the second day of the attack upon him, Sumner obtained the floor and replied to his assailants in a speech which, cutting deep into the pride and pretensions of the South, rankled long afterward in the bosoms of her representatives. Mercilessly he returned blow for blow upon the heads of his foes. The opening sentences of his reply he fired at his assailants collectively. Thus, Mr. President, since I had the honor of addressing the Senate 2 days ago, various senators have spoken. Of these, several have alluded to me in terms clearly beyond the sanction of parliamentary debate. Of this I make no complaint, though for the honor of the Senate, at least, it were well had it been otherwise. If to them it seems fit, courteous, parliamentary, let them unpack the heart with words and fall a-cursing like a very drab scullion. I will not interfere with the enjoyment they find in such exposure of themselves. They have given us a taste of their quality. After this preliminary defiance of the senatorial bunch of his assailants, he selected 2 of the company for more particular and energetic attention. These were Messrs. Butler and Mason, whom he proceeded immediately to acquaint with his own quality, to teach how to be severe and parliamentary at the same time. Their behavior reminded him of Jefferson's picture of the influence of slavery upon the master class. The parent storms, and the child looks on and imitates what he sees in the circle of smaller slaves, etc. The great Virginian adjudged that master a prodigy who was able to retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. But Sumner was certain that nobody who witnessed the senator from South Carolina or the senator from Virginia in this debate will place either of them among the prodigies described by Jefferson. In this wise he met the accusation that he had disowned the obligations of the Constitution. In swearing to support the Constitution at your desk, Mr. President, I did not swear to support it as you understand it. Oh, no, sir, or as the senator from Virginia understands it, by no means, or as the senator from South Carolina understands it, with a kennel of bloodhounds, or at least a dog in it, pawing to get free his hinder parts in pursuit of a slave. No such thing, sir. I swore to support the Constitution as I understand it, nor more, nor less. Mr. Butler had, in the course of his assault on Mr. Sumner, and with the customary swagger and pretensions of his class, boasted that the independence of America was won by the arms and treasure of slaveholding communities. To this grandiose assertion Sumner replied with a thoroughness of knowledge, a skill of statement, a weight and scorn of diction, which pulverized the false and foolish vaunt, and humbled the pride of its author and the insolent assumptions of his state and section in the dust and vanity of it. While Sumner was pounding upon this overweening laudation of slave-holding communities and was in the way of reducing it to powder with the great Northern hammer, its author, without rising from his seat, attempted to break the force of the blows which he was receiving by remark in interruption of the Northern giant. But Sumner was in no mood to let pass unnoticed such a piece of bad parliamentary manners, and accordingly administered to the offender a fit rebuke on the spot. And now, sir, the venerable senator, not rising from his seat and standing openly before the Senate, undertakes to deny that he has dealt in such comparisons. It is needless to say that after this incident Mr. Butler observed, the next time he wished to interrupt his Massachusetts antagonist, the etiquette of debate, rising from his seat and first addressing Mr. Sumner with the customary, "Will the senator allow me?" which did not fail to elicit the speaker's dignified and invariable response in that regard, "Certainly I yield the floor to the senator." But perhaps the most effective and characteristic stroke of his reply was the spirited manner in which he met the peremptory assertion of Mr. Mason that the Fugitive Slave Act does not deny the habeas corpus. But here is the passage alluded to, which is given entire. And now, for the present, I part with the venerable senator from South Carolina. Pursuing his inconsistencies and exposing them to judgment, I had almost forgotten his associate leader in the wanton personal assault upon me in this long debate. I mean the veteran senator from Virginia, Mr. Mason, who is now directly in my eye, with imperious look and in the style of Sir Forcible Feeble. That senator undertakes to call in question my statement that the Fugitive Slave Act denies the writ of habeas corpus, and in doing this he assumes a superiority for himself which permit me to tell him now in this presence nothing in him can warrant. Sir, I claim little for myself, but I shrink in no respect from any comparison with the senator veteran, though he be. Sitting near him, as has been my fortune since I had the honor of a seat in this chamber, I came to know something of his conversation, something of his manners, something of his attainment, something of his ability, something of his character, ay, sir, and something of his associations. And while I would not disparage him in these respects, I feel that I do not exalt myself unduly, that I do not claim too much for the position which I hold, or the name which I have established, when I openly declare that as Senator of Massachusetts and as a man, I place myself at every point in unhesitating comparison with that honorable assailant. And to his peremptory assertion that the Fugitive Slave Act does not deny the habeas corpus, I oppose my assertion peremptory as his own that it does, and there I leave that issue. When Mr. Sumner had made an end of his reply, Mr. Chase, who sat next to him, greeted him with the words, "You have struck slavery the strongest blow it ever received. You have made it reel to the center." And all things considered, taking the matter and the manner of that speech, this estimate of it by so competent a judge as was Mr. Chase is perhaps not in excess of its deserts. It was indeed a staggering blow which it dealt the slave power and its champions in the Senate. There were suggestions made for his expulsion from that body, and for a while there is no doubt that some such scheme was seriously entertained by his enemies of avenging themselves and the outraged self-love of their section upon him, and the ruthless Northern giant with his terrible trip-hammer attachment. The proposed act of expulsion was to be based upon Sumner's alleged refusal to recognize the obligations of the Constitution. He had not refused to recognize the obligations of the Constitution, only the obligations of the Constitution to return fugitive slaves. This he distinctly and repeatedly refused to recognize, and this refusal his enemies attempted to distort into a denial of the obligation of his oath to support the Constitution. The project of expulsion was, however, finally abandoned, and Mr. Sumner was sent to Coventry instead. Mr. Sumner's splendid reply to his assailants, while it augmented the intense and intolerable hate of the South toward him, added at the same time vastly to his popularity and influence in Massachusetts and through the free states generally. He was probably at the moment the most conspicuous representative of freedom in public life at the North. He was certainly the transcendent figure in public life in Massachusetts. John P. Hale, on his way from Washington to New York, heard but one expression in steamboat and railway car, and that from people of every political complexion in regard to the speech. It was one of unmingled gratification on the part of the gentler sex especially, he added. William I. Bowditch wrote from Boston. One gentleman whom I saw this forenoon said that he involuntarily gave 3 cheers when he had finished reading your speech, and an old hunker said to me smilingly, I really don't know but that I shall myself come out a Sumner man. Benjamin F. Butler, who was attending court at Concord, Massachusetts, and seeing people of all parties, heard but one sentiment expressed in regard to the great topic of conversation, Sumner's reply to his assailants, and that was of approval. Daniel Shattuck wrote, being one of the old-time Whigs, I was not pleased with your election to the high seat which you hold. For that opinion you will forgive me, I'm sure, when I say that I go with you now heart and soul, and approve all you have said in defense of your native state, whose sons I know approve your course, and wish you Godspeed. All of which indicated the good progress that the Freedom Power was making in the North, for the development of which Sumner, in and out of Congress, was strenuously striving. Certainly there was a revolution in public sentiment on the subject of slavery progressing on a grand scale through the free states, aided signally now by one thing, now by another. Now it was hurried forward by the execution of the Fugitive Slave Act, now by the abrogation of the Missouri Compromise, and now by such scene in Congress as and such an exhibition of backbone and power in a Northern representatives as have been just depicted. The title Defender of Humanity, rejected by Webster, had through brave words and brave deeds become Sumner's. End of chapter 9.